Okay, so Brian has built his raft, and he knows that that is their only choice is to take the raft down and try to get to that trading post. So here's chapter 16. It proved to be almost impossible to start. Brian took the briefcase down to the raft and decided to take a weapon. He left the bow, but took 2 lances he had made. One fish spear with tiny tines held open with a small stick that he had made to show Derek that you can use a spear as well as a bow to take small fish. The other was a straight spear with a fire-hardened point that he had decided to use if necessary on a moose. "Did it really attack you?" Derek had asked when he told of his time near the L-shaped lake and the moose attack. "Really? Came at you?" "And stayed with it," Brian said. "I couldn't do anything. It just kept coming back, pushing me down underwater until I pretended to be dead. Next time I'm going to fight back." So he had made the spear in hope that he would never have to use it. With the spear in the briefcase on the raft, he went back to the camp. Derek, the true reason for the raft. He had to get Derek down to the raft and on it without hurting him, or worse, drowning him. He turned Derek onto his back and grabbed him under the shoulders and tried to pull him down the bank. Derek didn't move. Brian pulled and the man just lay still, and Brian looked to see if his shoe had caught on a root by the fire or in the brush, but it had not. It just couldn't be that hard to move, He almost thought a body. Person, just a person on his back. He ought simply to skid down the bank. In the end, Brian did get him to skid, about 3 inches at a time. He heaved and jerked and pulled until Derek finally was on the bank, lying on his side, facing the water. There was a small ledge and a drop of approximately 6 inches to the water. This close into the shore, the lake was very shallow, not enough water to float the raft, and Brian had to horse the raft sideways to get it in so that it was lying sideways next to Derek, and just below him, grounded on the mud of the bottom. He kneeled in the water next to the raft. He had been soaked since starting to build the raft and figured to remain wet until they made it. He did not wish to think of the alternatives. He used his hip to jam the raft into the bank and reached across to pull Derek onto the raft. Again, it was like moving lead weight. Derek seemed bolted to the earth, and Brian had to settle for pulling first one end, then the other back and forth from Derek's arms to his ankles until the man was at last on the raft, which settled into the mud of the bottom under Derek's weight and remained solid. Brian positioned him first on his back and then decided he might choke, and moved him over into the side in the center of the raft. The middle cross piece on the raft caught Derek in the soft part just above his hip and helped to hold him in place. But Brian did not think it would be enough. He tore more strips from his jacket and made a tie-down. This he used to go from one side of the raft over Derek's shoulders to the other side to tie him into the position. Finally, with Derek lashed in, Brian used Derek's own jacket rolled up to make a pillow, which he worked beneath Derek's head. He checked the breathing and heartbeat again, and he was surprised to see that he did it almost automatically. It had been just hours, just over a day and a half, and he was already reacting automatically. "Derek, I don't know if you can hear me." He settled in the water next to the grounded raft and spoke to Derek's face. "I'm going to tell you anyway. We are going to take this raft down the river that leads from the lake. It's just under 100 miles to a trading post. The thing is, we can't stay here because, well, it just wouldn't work. And the radio is blown by the same lightning that hit you. So we can't call for help. So we have to do this. We have to do this." He shook his head, choked, realized that he was close to crying. "Oh, heck, we just have to do this. I hope it works out." He started to work the raft out of the mud and float it free when he thought of something. What if they came unexpectedly? If they just found Derek and Brian gone, they wouldn't know what to think. He had to leave a note. He opened the briefcase and took out a pencil and notebook. He wrote in big, large letters, "Big storm, Derek hit by lightning and in a coma, trying to raft river down to Rannoch's trading post 100 miles south. Come quick, Brian Robeson." He studied the note, then added the date and time. He had left the radio behind back up in the campsite, thinking it would be in the way. He ran back up to the shelter and found the radio in its plastic case and folded the note and put it in the case so that it struck out instantly. Then he tied the radio back up under the overhang with its carrying strap so that anybody coming into the shelter would be certain to see it. Back at the raft, he found that Derek's weight had pushed it into the bottom so hard it was difficult to get loose. He sawed it back and forth, one end out, then the other, and finally broke it free, though floating still in little more than a foot of water. "Good place to test it," he said. It seemed very stable with just Derek on it, and Brian carefully eased his knees onto the end by Derek's feet. The end sank lower, a few inches, but still was well above the surface. He raised on his knees and rocked back and forth, ready to climb off if it started over. The raft bobbed back to level and settled from the roll fast, the flat bottom slapping the water lightly. It's seaworthy. He climbed back off the raft and checked Derek again. He was resting in the same position. Some water had come up between the logs and made his shoulders wet, but his head was still up on the jacket pillow and was still dry. Brian looked at the sun. It was mid-afternoon. Dark was still 5 or 6 hours away. Not that it mattered. Once they started, they would have to keep moving, even through the night if they could. Time was everything. The river left the lake at the south end, a good half-mile away. Rather than try to move the raft across the lake, he decided to pull it around the edge in the shallows, and he started moving along the shore. The raft followed easily, and Brian let himself feel just the slightest bit positive for the first time since the lightning had hit them. The raft seemed to work well. The weather was holding. They had a map, and most of all, Derek was still alive. They had a shot at it. Chapter 17. Their luck held. Where the river left the lake, it cut a deeper channel in the soft bottom. It took Brian half an hour to move the raft down the side of the lake, pulling it along by hand, and where the river exited, he moved to the left shore and stopped for a moment. One last thought. He could still go back. It would be easy to take the raft back around the lake and possible, though certainly not easy, to drag Derek back up to the shelter. Once they were on the river with the current, he would not be able to work back. But he hesitated only a moment. Any choosing was already finished, and he shook his head. It was done. He climbed onto the back of the raft, kneeling at Derek's feet as he had before, and used the pole to push it away from the bank and out into the current. The river was 60 or 70 feet across, leaving the lake, and the current at the side seemed a bit slower. It caught the raft and pulled the nose around, so it aimed downstream, but along the edge, bouncing against the bank and sliding beneath overhanging willows and brush. Brian used the pole. The bottom was 4 or 5 feet down and pushed the raft sideways out into the center. It hesitated, seemed to hold for a moment as if trying to find the current. Then the moving water caught the logs and the raft started to move. Inside of 30 feet, it was matching the current, or close to it, and Brian watched the bank sliding past as the raft moved silently down the river. "We're on the way," he said to Derek. "It's working, and we're on the way." For 100 yards, the river moved straight, then curved hard to the left around a small hill, where Brian quickly found that a log raft is not the same as a boat. The current was not fast, as he had guessed earlier. It was about the speed of a person walking, but it was steady and strong. The logs were heavy, and once they were moving in a direction, they were hard to turn. As a matter of fact, Brian thought, watching the bank at the end of the curve come at him, they were impossible to turn. The river curved left and the raft went straight, cut across the curve and jammed into the bank. The jar of the sudden stop, even moving slowly, rocked the raft, and Derek rolled against the lashings and almost fell in. Brian leaped forward on the raft, fell on Derek and held him while the raft lurched, slid sideways and settled against the bank, where it stuck in the dirt and brush on the edge of the river. 100 yards and they were stopped. Brian slid off the raft, waist deep in the water, pushed it sideways back out into the current, climbed back on and sat for half a minute while the river curved back around to the right and the raft jammed into the left bank. Another 50 yards, 150 yards, and they were stuck twice. Brian swore, "I'm going to have to improve this or it will be a month on this river." He worked the raft into the middle again and it started to move. This time, as they came into a shallow curve and the raft started to move straight, he waited until the raft was close to the shore and then used the pole to jam into the bottom and fend off. He still shot wide on the turn, but they didn't jam into the bank, and by the 5th curve, he had found a way to use the crude paddle to steer the raft. He would come in close to the shore on the inside of the curve, then as soon as the raft was around it, he paddled the stern over and aimed it down the center of the river, and fought to keep it in the middle. They still did not always stay in the center of the best moving current, but as the afternoon wore on, Brian found that by frantically paddling through each curve, he kept the raft moving almost at the speed of the current and away from any brush or snags on the sides of the river. It worked. The river curved almost constantly, moving through small swamps and beneath overhanging trees, so thick it seemed to be a jungle, and he was constantly fighting the raft. Inside of 3 hours, he felt his back and arms aching and knew that if he didn't stop to rest a bit now and then, he would never be able to make it. He decided to stop every hour for 10 minutes. Derek had told him once that that was what the military did on long marches, a 10-minute break every hour, and by the end of the 4th hour, he was more than ready for it. As it happened, the break came when the river straightened out, so he didn't lose any time. The raft kept sliding as he leaned back and rested his arms and back. He used his hands to cup water into his face, rubbing the back of his neck. The evening sun was still hot when it hit him, as they came out of the patches of cool shade made by the trees on the bank, and the cool water on his neck refreshed him. Let's see how we're doing. He opened the briefcase and took out the map. The river was accurately drawn, or seemed to be, and as near as he could figure it, they'd come about 8 miles. Not as good as he'd thought. 8 miles in 4 hours. 2 miles an hour. That meant 50 hours. 2 full days on top of the days they'd just used making the decision and getting ready to go. 4 days without water for Derek. He looked at the unconscious form and saw that the sun had burned his neck where the skin was exposed. Well, if Derek couldn't drink, Brian could still keep him cool. That might help. He took off his t-shirt and soaked it in the water. Brian used it as a cloth to wipe Derek's face and neck with cool water during his break. This ordeal was amazing to him, and he wondered at how it could be. Things happened so fast, changed so fast. Derek had been, no, he thought. Derek was still one of those people who seemed so alive. He was eager to learn, happy, bright. He seemed indestructible. Even now, lying on his side on the raft in the evening light, his chest rising and falling as he breathed, he looked like he could wake up any second. Cut down. That's how Brian thought of it. He had read a history of the Civil War, and the author had written about the men being cut down by fire. That's how Derek looked to Brian now, cut down. How could that be? Here he was, no different really, had been in the same place at the same time, and he was all right. And Derek was cut down. He wiped Derek's face several times. All this time the raft had kept moving, and when his break was over, he saw that they were coming into another hard bend. He put the t-shirt back on wet and picked up the paddle and started to work, swinging the stern of the raft, keeping it in the middle of the current. It would be dark in an hour or so, but he thought that it wouldn't matter. His hands were raw from the wood of the paddle, and he thought that it wouldn't matter either. All that mattered now was to keep moving.